Hi, dear 强烈谈's audience. Oh my God, I need to have an English name as soon as possible for our show. So, welcome everyone. Happy New Year. So we now have come to the third session of our special New Year edition. So today we have a very, very special and handsome and international friend to join us. And we're going to discuss a very cool topic, new energy and green revolution. So, and about just a little bit of preview. So about 1 hour later, we'll have another surprise, and a famous professor will join us for the second session, and we'll discuss about Tesla. So we will have credit cookies for you guys. So actually, basically, we have 2 credit cookies in our show. So hope you enjoy this show. So first of all, I want to introduce our very special first international friend to our show, Gabriel. So welcome, Gabriel. And Happy New Year.
Welcome, Gabriel.
Cheers. Thanks a lot. Happy New Year. And it's great to have the opportunity to chat with you today.
Yeah, thank you. So Gabriel actually is, just now Catherine introduced that Gabriel is a very, very senior ESG investment expert in this field. So he has maybe the longest history among the investment professionals in this field. So maybe Gabriel, can you give a little bit of brief introduction about yourself, your story? So why you choose this field?
Yeah, sure. So I've been working in investment research and sustainability for a long time now. I started out my career working with Goldman Sachs in Australia. And at the time, it was around the time that Goldman launched what they call GS Sustain. So this was a very innovative product at the time, quite mainstream now in that everyone's jumped on board ESG investment. But basically what it was taking into account ESG issues as part of a fundamental investment process. So basically saying that if you want to invest over a long-term time horizon, you have to take into account ESG because it's just part of identifying good businesses. And so that's been the evolution of that product. I moved up to Asia and joined the team directly in 2014. And so have spent a lot of time speaking to regulators in companies across the region over the last 6-7 years, watching the ESG landscape evolve, and more recently joined BNP Paribas Asset Management, so moving from sell side to buy side. And I've been there for 2 years now, and I'm currently the Global Head of Sustainability Research, leading the research agenda, ESG integration, scoring, and a lot of the assessments that we do of companies.
Wow, so you and Catherine have been knowing each other for several years. I think you two have a very, very similar background. Am I right, Catherine?
Yeah, so actually when I first came to Hong Kong and established my company AvantFaire, that was really the time that I was actively discussing with the local participants in this field, and there wasn't a lot of people in the ESG field, actually. So it was really easy to get to know Gabriel because we were just a few of us. And then I keep on seeing Gabriel in a lot of the events and when I was being as a speaker. And even once I was actually publishing an article about impact investing. And then I saw Gabriel's article just before mine. So we really been seeing each other a lot because I think for this field and especially people pushing this field towards the frontier, and now impact investing is really becoming the mainstream. I think there are just a few advocacies, especially in the APAC market right now, and Gabriel is one of them, and this is why we have seen each other a lot.
Yeah, so great story. So just a little bit cap of our special New Year edition. We have 3 sessions where we discuss about the most important investment topics for the next 2 years. So we have discussed agriculture, and we have discussed the virtual economy, and the new energy field is also what we believe will have the biggest impact for the global economy. So first of all, I'm going to ask you guys a question. I want to pick your brains. So what is really behind this this new energy or green energy, alternative energy narrative? Is it really because of climate change, or is it because of the energy shortage? So the reason I want to ask about this is because as a non-ESG person, So I've been coming to this awareness of this green energy quite late, much later than you guys. So what I've been listening to all these years is basically two narratives that why we have to start this green revolution. So one is we have an energy shortage, that the fossil fuels is not enough to support this global economy for the next, 20 to 50 years. That's why we need to find some alternative energy to support this global economy. And another strong narrative is climate change. So, which I think all of us have already experienced a lot during these few years. That from the cities that both Catherine and me come from, Tianjin, we haven't been seeing snowing for many years. So I just want to ask you guys, so these two narratives, these two stories, so which one is the one that we need to pay attention to? So Gabriel?
Sure, I'll jump in first. I think it's a really interesting question because I don't think that there's only one key driver behind the adoption of the energy transition, behind renewable energy. I think there's a lot of related issues which are all contributing to the development. And so the energy scarcity argument has been a traditional view for a very long time, in that if we look at global oil reserves and then the rate of development, you can see that the two lines aren't going to continue moving in the right direction forever. There'll have to be a point where we run out of energy. The problem with that thinking, though, is that it doesn't take into account technological developments. So, for example, shale oil and gas, regardless of the environmental or social issues around it, so if we leave ESG to one side, that can unlock huge amounts of reserves. Similarly, new technology has been able to make previously unaccessible reserves potentially viable. So there's a few tricks up our sleeves that we all have in order to continue to improve the availability of oil. But at some stage, that is going to run into a hard stop, in that it's a finite resource. It's not a renewable resource. The other elements that I think are really important driving the green revolution or the energy transition revolution, it's a combination of government policy and looking at the pollution and the health costs. So billions a year are spent on fossil fuel subsidies, but also this contributes to a huge social burden in terms of health impacts, in terms of premature mortality. There's a lot of problems, and even visibly in everyone's life, the air pollution that gets created. So all of these sorts of topics mean that there's been a growing social awareness of trying to address the issues. The other key element which has helped contribute to that and enable an energy transition has actually been that the cost curve for renewables has been plummeting really, really quickly. So this means that now there's no longer such a huge trade-off between economic growth, development, and a renewable alternative. And if we go back to 98 and the Kyoto Agreement, this is actually one of the reasons, in my opinion, why that failed to an extent or didn't get the objectives it wanted, was because people had never been able to decouple economic growth and carbon emissions. And so when you're asking for people to go transition to renewable energy 20 years ago, you were essentially saying stop economic development or stop the same pace of development. Whereas now, if we look at the massive solar industries, the massive wind industries, the ability to actually deliver renewable energy projects that are actually cheaper than some of the fossil fuel alternatives, you've got a really strong economic argument for an energy transition. And so this is the economic argument which is even in excess of looking at a climate change issue. So one of the things I like to say to climate change deniers is that you don't have to believe in climate change to make renewable energy a good investment, because the economics literally just stack up in so many different places. So I think that it's a long answer, but I think that it's a combination of government policy, social awareness, and then also the economics starting to tilt in the favour of renewable energy. The other awesome thing about renewable energy is that if we look at electric vehicles or electric energy versus internal combustion engine energy, the efficiency is way higher. With a combustion engine, you lose so much to noise, to heat, to all of these other sorts of things. So the actual transmission of the raw power source into mobility or heat or whatever you're trying to generate is actually quite low. Whereas with EVs, it's way higher. So you've got just a better technology, essentially, to drive the outcomes.
Wow, that's a great answer.
Yeah. So I guess I will just try to fill in the holes or making some summaries from what Gabriel has said. So I think what Gabriel has said about the economical development around the transitioning of energy is really an important argument because traditionally when we talk about to decarbon and especially talking to the developing countries, more likely the arguments from the developing countries are to say this is rather unfair because they haven't actually reached the stage of industrialization and not even mentioning about having enough energy to educate, for example, their next generation or to be sufficient to actually survive in their countries. For example, a lot of the African countries are experiencing this. So the previous argument or the previous solution for that argument was really about leapfrogging. So helping the developing countries to sort of jump ahead and leapfrog without actually entering into this industrialization stage. Which I find that's really debatable and is a little bit controversial because on one hand, at that time, we don't have the compatible technology to help the developing countries to leapfrog. But then on the other hand, we don't want them to actually burn that much of the fossil fuel to add on top of what we have already done and accumulated on the carbon emission. So this is really a kind of controversial argument that was actually going on. But then with what Gabriel has mentioned about the technology development, what we are experiencing now is a much cheaper way to help the developing countries to leapfrog while they are transitioning their energy facilities into either the electricity ones or the other ones. So this is becoming a kind of new solution because we never had this solution before. So I think this argument that is right now we are experiencing or presenting to the whole global community is really important. And then the other thing that I pick up from what Gabriel has mentioned is really the traditional thinking about scarcities. So based on our basic economic theory about energy scarcities and other natural resources scarcities, what has been discussed about all over the world, especially about the strategy side on different countries' initiatives, is really about how they should guarantee that the scarcity is actually being able to compete against each other. So in this way, energy scarcity has always been known for all the countries. And this is the reason why that we had a lot of arguments and also we had a lot of the conflicts that's been around. So not only that we need to make sure that our own people are secured, but then on the other hand, we're also competing with each other. So it's really not the same kind of picture that we are actually seeing right now, that there are more and more countries and private companies come together and then participating in this energy transition. So I would say with what we have discussed and mentioned, we are actually heading into a new era that there are more collaborations and people are being nicer to each other, and we are able to finally sort of solve the problem that we used to have.
Yeah. Well, that's a great answer. I totally agree that people are much nicer. There's more and more nice people. But on the other hand, there's a lot of, there's more and more suspicious people, I mean, like me. So again, as a non-ESG person, I'm always thinking about, actually, I totally agree with what Gabriel mentioned just now. The cost curve has been going down. And the cost issue actually is the most important issue that stop everything moving on. But my question is, by how much? Is it because we still have this green energy mix narrative going on, right? So how much more traditional energy or physical resources that we have to use to produce the new energy, like the solar, wind, electricity? So is it really economic sustainable, or the external impact, like for the environment, is really, I mean, the cost curve or technology improvement has already reached to a balancing point? Because I'm not sure you guys, I'm pretty sure you guys know this concept like EROI, right? so the net energy yield. So there has been discussion going on that if you produce, so the ROI actually is how much unit of energy that you have to put in to have one output of the new energy. So the ratio for fossil fuel is 100, means that you put just 1 unit of energy, you can produce 100 units of fossil fuel. But for the new energies that I checked some data yesterday, so like for example, for the coal, that the traditional coal that you have to burn is about 80. So for the new energy, I mean the new technology coal that you can that don't generate any smoke is about I cannot remember 5. But for solar, solar is about 17, and the wind is about 7. So I mean, until now, I'm not sure how updated my data is, but until now, I still it still look like it's quite not quite efficient compared to the traditional, I mean, energy. So how you guys comment on that?
Yeah, so I can jump in first again. I think it's a really good point because it comes down to the best way of measuring it and how is the short-term return from power generation, is that the right way of thinking about it? Because if we look at one of the huge advantages of fossil fuel is that the energy is available whenever you want it. And the energy density is actually really, really high, which was the reason why we moved from coal to oil and gas and other sorts of issues to begin with, was essentially that it's just a much more efficient fuel than using kind of like steam boilers and wood or coal. So that energy density and the ability to turn it on and off is a huge advantage of traditional fossil fuels. And it's actually one of the biggest challenges with migrating the power grid towards renewables, partly because by definition, renewables are intermittent in terms of generation. So you can only use solar when the sun's shining. You can only use wind when the wind's blowing. So it's not always available. And that also comes down to some of the statistics you were highlighting around the life cycle usability and utilization rates of these assets tend to be lower than a traditional fossil fuel plant, which can be 80 or 90% utilization versus much lower for wind. So that's one way of looking at it, definitely. And where technology is changing to try and bridge some of those issues is around battery storage, in order to be able to smooth demand and power generation, and to think about the best way of integrating fossil renewables into an energy grid and phasing out fossil fuels. So this is one of the reasons why I think the concept of an energy transition is critical, with the focus being transition, not a overnight switch to 100% renewables, which some people are calling for, but in Asia is, in my opinion, not a practical solution. Yeah. So I think that that's one side of the argument. The other thing I wanted to highlight is that it also depends on how you're measuring efficiency, because if you look at mobility, and a colleague of mine did some analysis on this, so these are all his analysis and numbers, but if you look at the transport system currently in passenger vehicle market, and you completely wiped off what the current infrastructure we had, and you said, okay, let's build from scratch. Let's start from a blank piece of paper. What do we build? Do we build renewables and EVs? Or do we dig oil, and do we put down gas stations and use cars, like internal combustion engine vehicles? And in order for oil to be competitive with the renewable solution on a cost basis, so in other words, how much mobility miles do you get per dollar of investment into that system, oil would need to be $10 to $15 a barrel. And this is with current technology for EVs and current technology for solar. And this is before taking into account any negative externalities around coal inputs, health impacts, climate change impacts, all of these sorts of things. So for me, that in itself just tells you that if you were starting from a blank piece of paper, the return on energy or the benefit from investment in the system over the life cycle of the system, not just from being able to turn it on and off, is actually starting to tilt towards some of the renewable energy. So this is definitely not true in all cases and all circumstances, but I think it's a really interesting point to take into account that depending on how you measure it and what the use case is, and over what life cycle, renewable energy is increasingly becoming competitive with some end use cases.
Okay.
I just wanted to say, to the addition of what Gabriel has mentioned, I think for each country and for each different geographical specifics, people are actually having very interesting regional solutions depending on their geographical aspects. So in a lot of the different ASEAN countries, because they are some of them are rich in hydro and some of them are rich in sunlight. Some of them do not have sunlight though. So for example, there are places in Cambodia and also in Laos and other regions that half of the year they will be experiencing raining situation. But then for different regional government and also participants, they're actually figuring out different ways to make their energy production more efficient. So it's really depending on how they understand their geographical location have as natural resources that will be able to generate renewable energy. I think this is quite interesting because I have recently also talked with some different people in China mainland, and they all have different solutions. And I know that, Gabriel, we have talked about the hydro situation in China, and I think this is a kind of great example that how we can actually use local specific power generation method to make it more efficient in terms of the renewable energies generation.
I guess a more decentralized way might be a good solution. Yeah. Well, that's great to hear. I guess there's solutions. I think when it need to come both from top down and bottom up. So for some of the solutions that you guys mentioned, for decentralized, maybe local, from local bottom up, maybe a good solution. But for some of the, like nation-supported projects or programs to support this faster transition of the whole country into a cleaner energy, might be a solution, though it needs a lot of investment. I'm pretty sure the cable that you built from Australia to Singapore requires a lot of budget, a cost. So the point is how we get a balance or find a balance in between. So actually that comes down to my next question. So I want to talk about politics. I'm sorry. So in terms of bottom up, in terms of top down, so I'm pretty sure that every country has been making a lot of efforts. That's for many years. I don't even remember that I've been hearing about this climate change battle for how many years. So I'm pretty sure Catherine and Gabriel is the expert in this. So can you guys give us a brief introduction about what happened all those years? So maybe we start from 1990 until now. So which country start this a new concept or start effort first, and what countries join on later, and who dominate the conversation or dialogue now? So kind of a power changing process. So yes, Gabriel?
Sorry, just 1 second. I think I heard some echo. Can you?
Yeah.
XiaPao, did you hear any echoes?
Gabriel's signal is not very good, I guess, because it's.
Yes, getting better.
Getting better.
Yeah, is that a lot better?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's getting better.
That's a lot better.
Okay, great. For some weird reason,
great. Please continue.
Okay, yeah, my computer blows up every now and then. Okay, so I'll start that segment or that answer again because I'm not sure how much you got. So if we look at what's been driving, or the countries and regions that have been driving climate ambition or climate change, I think that it's fair to say that a lot of the ambition has initially come from Europe. And if we think about broader ESG integration, it actually happened at around the same time, where there was a first focus on corporate governance through the 90s with the Cadbury Commission and other sorts of reviews into pension investments, which was really the foundation of the corporate governance movement within listed markets in the UK. And so if we think about the evolution of environmental policy and environmental focus. I think that the Kyoto Protocol, Kyoto Agreement, was one of the first times that this actually came to the fore with a formal agreement signed by international parties. But the commitments under that and the way that various countries have moved towards honouring those commitments has varied significantly over time. And a lot of this depends on who's currently in power in individual countries and and their views on climate change. And the best example of this is the 180-degree change that the US has made since the change in administration, and rejoining the Paris Agreement, talking about renewables. I kept reading about the Biden boom in renewable energy and things like that. So I think that it can be quite volatile. But what I would say is that at the moment, I would argue that Europe and China, I would see as leading with regards to environmental policy and development, but also ambition on that front and climate change ambition. So I think that if we look around the region, we saw a huge number of net zero commitments starting to come out. And I think that there's a few things driving this. One is that the economics of it are making it more feasible, as we were discussing. So it's no longer a statement which is going to kill your economy if you believe in renewable energy or a transition to renewable energy. The other side is that the economics make some of these solutions really, really attractive. So we're starting to see private business actually get ahead of government in some countries. So I would argue that the ambition of the private sector in Australia is actually stronger than the government's ambition in Australia when it comes down to these sorts of things. So you're seeing utilities, you're seeing elements of like there's an Australian business which is in steel production and iron ore production. They're basically looking at pivoting almost 100% to green hydrogen. And so this, and purely because they think it's the future of decarbonising heavy industrial businesses and heavy road freight transport and other sorts of issues. So I think that we're seeing a combination of private interest moving just purely because it's going to make the money. And we're seeing leadership from Europe and China on green taxonomies, on environmental regulation, and that's having a spillover effect into other parts of Asia. I don't think it was any coincidence that shortly after China made its net zero announcement, a lot of other countries in the region also made net zero announcements, not wanting to be left behind, and almost as a bit of competitive tension. So I think that it's difficult to make a statement to say that one country has always been ahead, because if we go back 20 years, the technology and the state of development in China made it very difficult for them to have the same ambition they have today.
But I think what Gabriel has mentioned about the convergence between the EU taxonomy and also the China's green project catalog is a really interesting aspect, because we are now seeing a lot of the projects and also the interests that are converging into the similar kind of ways of arranging business and doing countries' initiative, which actually I think will lead to a greater way of collaboration in between. And I think this is really interesting because not only China, as Gabriel, you have mentioned, China has actually claimed to commit into carbon neutrality by 2060, but all the other countries that follows it will not want to leave behind. So this is really interesting. And on the other hand, it's actually indicating that China and Europe has really been leading the field to another frontier, and not also mentioning about the recent trade agreement that's signed between Europe and China, and they have a specific focus on sustainability kind of investments and collaboration. So I think there will be a lot of the newer economy that we can talk about.
Exactly. I really want you guys to talk about China, comment on China. But before that, maybe I'm a little bit of dark. So I want to know where the ambitions really come from, you know. So Yeah, I totally agree with Catherine and Gabriel that we have seen suddenly somehow of many countries. I mean, everyone is so ambitious on clean energy, like new energy. So I'm thinking about, is it an opportunity for some country to change the geopolitical power shifting? I mean, because we all know that we have seen a lot of ugly shows going on after the Second World War around the oil countries, Russia, Middle East, so agency wars, and somebody gained powers because of oil, and somebody sacrificed. I mean, there's a lot of ugly shows. So I'm thinking about how much do you think the country's real agenda behind? Is it really? I mean, other than protect the globe, how much drive behind that they want to take this as an opportunity? For example, China, if I take this clean energy power as if I drive down the cost first, so I have the biggest supply of clean energy. So sooner or later, all the other countries have to rely on China's new energy supply. So they have this dominance going on, and U.S. don't want that happen. So whatever. So what do you guys think of the geopolitics? Power shifting?
Yeah, let me take this question first then. Yeah, thank you. So for me, actually, I think about this also in the way of national strategies and as well as competition that I just mentioned. So traditionally, actually, environmental threats has been a threat, but it was just not that kind of immediate. So people don't see that the tides can actually destroy the whole village. So they don't see that as a survival kind of stress as comparing to, for example, what happened during the Cold War about the nuclear competition, as well as other competitions around the Second World War. So right now, people are actually realizing environmental threats are actually threatening the human survival. So this, by definition, pushed a lot of the interest from the politics side and strategy side into the environmental protection as well as transitioning of the energy. On the other hand, I do also think that this is also a part of the power competition. Because energy, actually, especially renewable energy, is developing so fast. It's also because of the technology development. So traditionally, people tend to forget about the development of technology and how it actually plays within a country's strategy and a country's interest. And this has generally changed because of the new digital era and the cyber security problems that we have actually seen these days. So people tends to focus more on technology and how technology has been developed in order to assist different interests and different political plans. So on this hand, I think that China do have a big advantage because we actually are developing technology really fast. And on the other hand, competitively to say, as Gabriel has mentioned, China's ESG has not been having great volatility. For example, China has been always supporting Paris Agreement, and while they are also forming the subcommittee to actually support environmental benefits after the Paris Agreement. So relatively speaking, on the volatility side, China also has an advantage because it doesn't volatile that much as comparing to the current situation that we are seeing in the rest of the world.
So what's your comment, Gabriel?
Sure. So I actually think that it's a super, super interesting topic because geopolitics, so much of it has been around energy security. And if we go back to World War I, World War II, and actually the origins of the emergence of the need for oil and the need for fossil fuels, it's literally the difference between having a fleet or ships or planes versus sailing boats. And so if you think about the difference between naval power or air power that can contribute, it essentially defines
military instruments.
Country. Exactly. It basically defined a country's military power, whether you had access to oil. And if you didn't have access to oil, you essentially couldn't defend yourself or you couldn't go to war. So it became a critical part of national security to have access to these reserves. What I find fascinating now is that if that's shifting as fast as it looks like it's shifting with the adoption of renewables and alternative energy, like we're clearly not there yet where it's 100% replacing fossil fuels. But if it does, what does that mean about countries with endowments to energy? It completely changes the geopolitical landscape, because it's no longer about being lucky in terms of digging and coming up with oil. It's actually being lucky about having the land, the wind, and other sorts of areas where you can generate renewable energy. So I think that it's got a huge potential to reshape a lot of political dynamics and interactions within countries. The other interesting thing about one of the key differences that is not very often spoken about renewable versus fossil fuels is that renewable energy is by nature abundant and deflationary, which is the exact opposite of fossil fuel, which is scarce and inflationary. And so what I mean by inflationary is that with fossil fuels, the first thing you do is you dig the cheapest bit of oil out of the ground. And immediately after that, you go to the next most expensive, next most expensive, next most expensive. And then before you know it, you're trying to figure out ways to drill through an ice cap in the Arctic to get deep sea oil, and huge, highly risky, costly projects. Whereas if you compare that to renewable energy, once you've built it, the energy comes for free. So it's more of a utility type of cost or return model, as opposed to a mining or extractive type cost model. So what that can mean is that once you've actually got these things established and built, it could mean that we see a huge deflationary pressure as technology improves, as scale improves across the entire energy space. And a fascinating question is, what does it actually do to geopolitics if energy is no longer a competitive advantage?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so what kind of advantage we may actually develop? I just wanted to chip in the question, because I think we are about to fortune tell something really interesting. So I just wanted to ask the question to all of you, and also myself, like, if energy will not become a kind of competitive advantage for any country, and especially in any of the agenda, what would be the next one that we should actually keep ourselves competitive or more efficient?
Cryptocurrency? Sorry. Because Gabriel bring up a very interesting point. Actually, I never thought about it. And I think actually it's quite interesting if you compare to cryptocurrency, So Bitcoin actually is a depreciation factor. It's because Bitcoin have only that much amount, so it become more and more scarce. So, but for the fiat currency credit, government credit backed of the fiat currency, actually it can come out like as much as you want. So it's like I don't know how I come to this comparison, but it's really an interesting point. But on the other hand, if the green energy or the new energy is not that big of a value compared to fossil fuels, so why countries have to invest in trillions and trillions to get the advantage? Get the dominance of producing the green energy. So it have to be pure. I don't know.
So the way I would see it, and feel free to contradict me, is that if we look at what makes nations competitive, and if we look at competitive advantage, and this is going to Catherine's question, is that low-cost energy has always been a huge source of competitive advantage, because it means that not only if we take the military component out of it, but if we just look at industry, the ability to run a factory with cheaper energy than your neighbor means that you can produce all else equal, means that you can produce your products for cheaper than your neighbor. And so therefore you have a competitive advantage in global trade. So I think that low-cost energy and access to energy and access to energy grids are a huge element of poverty alleviation, of economic development, and they're basically the backbone of modern industrialization. So if that becomes really cheap and really affordable everywhere, and it becomes less of a differentiating factor, we then move to the other questions as to what is going to drive competitive advantage for countries. And I think this is all the same questions that it's historically been around natural resource endowment, geographical endowment, education systems, rule of law, protection of private property, and other sorts of elements. All of these sorts of preconditions which can can help a country evolve, strength of healthcare system, all of these sorts of things. But it moves energy from being a key determining factor to something that would probably be less important. I'm saying this with air quotes because it depends on geography. If you look at very, very, very small countries that have high population density and lots of rain, it's difficult for them to benefit from renewable energy as much as a country like China or like Australia, where you have huge parts of the country where no one is there and it's desert with the sun shining all the time. So there's a lot of different advantages that can come in, but they end up being a different set of advantages. And even some small countries, if you've got the right conditions of glacier melt or seasonal water flows, you can then have huge hydropower. So it shifts what constitutes a geographical competitive advantage.
Wow. Yeah, and also what Gabriel you have said about the huge hydropower after the melting of the poles is a contradicting but interesting idea that I also notice about, because for example a country like Canada where I used to work, like in the middle there's nothing, and then at the top there's nothing, there's just ices, and then now people can get access to it, which means there can be more tourism industries that's developing. Sadly, that's actually true, and also there will be more hydropower that's coming out of it. So I think I just wanted to chip in about this because it's contradicting to global warming, but then people can actually take advantage out of this even.
Yeah, right. So guys, I want to move to,
Sorry. So I haven't done my prediction, so I thought maybe I should also did some prediction.
So please, your prediction. Yeah,
no, I just thought, based on what Gabriel has said about the cheaper of the energies and other things that XiaPao you have mentioned as well, I think in the near future, while energy is getting cheaper and cheaper and more efficient, people may tend to compete more on the education front. The reason that I thought about this is really because of the COVID situation that's happened last year, that I find no matter whether it is a developing country or a developed country, people all actually had problems in their education system. And the way that China has kept its younger generation educated, for me, is a huge advantage, because after a few years, because the youngsters, their brain cells will only develop, or the size of the brain can only develop before the age of 5 to 8. So this is a really valuable time that if it gone, then it's just gone. So for me, for keeping the education system stable as well as being more efficient and educate the kids in the right way became a future advantage, at least intellectually, for the country to develop. So that's my personal prediction.
Yeah, I think this is the best prediction that we have. Yeah, I guess.
Thank you.
Education, that we have to invest in human intelligence. Yeah. So guys, and Gabriel.
We could devote an entire session to that, but I think it's an absolutely fascinating topic, especially if we look at the change in industrialization and the shift from human labor being, if we think about factors of output and defining national product. If we look at the traditional view of human capital and technological and physical capital, I think that what we're seeing is that the need for human capital is shifting from a manual labor perspective to automation taking a lot of those roles and jobs, which means that the skill level that the workforce has or requires in order to be a valuable participant keeps getting higher and higher and higher. And so if we're looking at the future makeup of industry and of employment, I think that's going to be a huge factor, and it's tied into sustainability and ESG because of the potential for it to cause social disconnect if education isn't taking place in order to make sure that we have jobs and opportunities for enough people.
Yeah, exactly. Guys, I should have invited you guys to the second session, which we discussed about virtual economy. I mean, it's an economy that purely
we can have another session.
I should have invited you guys to discuss there. It's super interesting. So yeah, because we have a very little time left. So before we move to the next session, I have a last question that I really want to ask you guys. It's about investment. I know currently the best solution for reach the carbon neutrality, like it is carbon trading, carbon offsetting. We build the exchange that people can trade carbon quota around. So in your classic economic point of view, that is the best solution, maybe. But actually, as a trading profession, so if I were going to trade carbon, I really believe market, like people's behavior on the market, is really the best solution to reach some of the, I mean the goals. If you want to control the carbon, if we set a very high price and it can be tradable on the market, and people can just offset your quota, that can be a quite good solution. But maybe I didn't read that a lot, but from what I see now, it's not a very good solution. So first of all, carbon is not like gold or stock that is not fungible in my point of view. So to be able to like create a very big market that people can trade freely, you need the thing to be fungible. Like one carbon is a carbon. But I think every carbon behind have its own backstories. So carbon in Australia is different from carbon from China. So how you trade that? Another thing is the concept of cap and trading. I'm not sure it's a good method, but to me, the cap is set up by human beings. So it's the result of the power balancing between the government and the huge companies. I mean, like how much cap that you set is not scientific formula. It's set by the government after negotiation with the big companies, right? So which means I'm pretty sure a lot of big companies, they have a lot of surplus and under the caps. So you can basically put that surplus on your balance sheet and you can boost up the share price. So I'm not sure how it's now, but to me, the market, at least till now, the rules are not very, not very well designed. What's your guys' opinion?
Yeah.
Maybe who's first?
Yeah, actually, I recently talked to a lot of the schools in mainland China where they also meet the similar kind of situation. So from this kind of example, what I thought about the most important or the core of it is really about data management and data creation. So because if you want to calculate your GHG, so which is the greenhouse gas emission, so you have to actually have devices that can actually count physically about any data and then put it into a data storage room and then to generate your carbon footprint. So for example, if we are to ask all the schools in China or all the kind of related, for example, an industrialized city to actually buy and sell credits, then what we have to do is to help them to collect the data and help them to calculate what they have been emitted. And because, for example, if we want to set a benchmark or a standard or the cap, that we also have to make sense policy-wise, because then we also need to understand regional-wise what is our energy emission at the current stage and where we wanted to get into for the next stage. So this actually came all into the data management and data collection kind of problem. So in order to actually set a clearer policy, we actually need to help the local community to actually calculate their GHG data. And on the other hand, because there are also ways that local community do not understand how to trade the carbon credits and other things. So we also need to have implementable policies, especially local-wise, to guide them to be able to trade it correctly. So this is just a real example that I've recently been talking with people that I found that, for example, a school that's they have a lot of graduating students, then they will have to calculate how much paper they use, how much printing they get, and also like the energy they use to have classes and the digital devices they have. So there are a lot of details within it. So in order to have them to trade the credits correctly and have the most efficient way of running, we still have quite a bit of the way to go. I mean, globally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Gabriel?
So I really like the way you framed it, because it's basically highlighting the extent of the problem, in that if we think about classical economics, we've got a problem in that we have an unpriced externality. So you've got a business activity which isn't being penalised for hurting another part of the economy or the environment, which is the essential problem with carbon emissions. So the question is to how to solve that. If we open up our finance textbook, which I know everyone keeps on their desk, it will tell you that the best way to do it is a market mechanism of pricing it, which comes into carbon pricing, cap and trade systems, other sorts of ways of making it a market dynamic. All the problems you highlighted are the reasons why that finance textbook doesn't really work in real life in a lot of instances, in that you have competing interest, captive interest of lobbying groups being able to limit the extent to which a carbon price might be effective. You've also got problems of what constitutes a carbon credit. So if I find a forest somewhere and convince a landowner to sell me the credits for that, does that mean that I can then go on polluting and dumping things into my local river, or polluting the air? And so does it cause change in behaviour, or is it just reallocation is it just a big financial machine of reallocating money from one part of the world to another, but not really changing behaviour? So with all of those problems, I'm still a massive fan of carbon pricing in theory, because one of the big things but I think the implementation currently has been challenging. One of the best elements of cap and trade, and even if we look at the introduction of the carbons market in China at the start of the year, or moving from pilot phase to proper introduction, and same in Europe, what this provides is it hasn't been effective yet anywhere in the world in addressing carbon emissions or lowering emissions, but it gives people the data around who's polluting, and it gives the government a mechanism for moving towards their objective. So the current cap and trade is unlikely to have a huge impact on the way businesses work. They've got, most of the heavily polluting businesses have enough credits so that they don't need to change their behaviour. But it gives a mechanism for the government to ratchet up as we get closer to 2060 in order to change behaviour and in order to enforce the pricing of it. So if you put strong government ambition and strong government safeguards around it and remove the potential for corporate influence and lobbying, I'm a huge fan of carbon trading and for carbon pricing. Unfortunately, I am yet to see it really bite anywhere in the world. Like, the EU is the only place where I've seen the carbon price jump up recently, and I think it's going to continue to accelerate rapidly from here. So we could start to see more impacts from this, but it's from my perspective, it's a tool that hasn't really had the promised impact yet in the world.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So maybe you can consider have your own advice projects to the government how to implement a good market. So guys, it's really nice talking. So we have to move to the second session, where we will continue discussing the very exciting topic of Tesla and EV cars.
I think actually to make a transition from this topic to the next, what Gabriel has mentioned was really interesting, because he mentioned about actually the basic values that people actually evaluate what is actually important and what is not. So by pricing it, it's actually the first and the only way that we can actually find values or uncover the true values of our society or the system especially. So I think it's also a very good way of transitioning to our next topic about Tesla valuation and other EV related.
Exactly. So guys, we'll see you guys in a few seconds. Join the second session.
Gabriel, there is a second link. So if you click the second link, we can join for the next one.
I need to enter it manually. So give me a second. I'll have to log out and log back in.
Okay.
Cool. Okay. Cheers.
Okay. See you.